It started as just another travel day. I had checked my itinerary twice, packed my carry-on with everything I needed, and even arrived at the airport a little earlier than usual. I liked to be prepared. The terminal was buzzing with the usual mix of tired business travelers, excited vacationers, and families trying to keep their kids from running off. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I rolled my suitcase toward the security checkpoint, casually glancing at the digital board displaying flight departures. Everything was on time. Perfect. I pulled out my ID and boarding pass, ready to get through this part of the process quickly. The first TSA officer barely looked at me as he gestured me forward. I placed my bag on the conveyor belt, slipped off my shoes, and walked through the scanner, the usual routine. But then something changed. The moment I stepped through, a loud beep went off. I froze, surprised. "Step aside, ma'am," the officer said, his tone flat but firm. I did as I was told, moving to the side while another officer approached, a tall, stocky man with a stiff expression. "Random screening," he said, not really explaining anything. I sighed, knowing there wasn't much I could do but comply. I had nothing to hide. He patted me down, shoulders, arms, back, legs, before waving a handheld scanner around me. It didn't beep, not once. Yet he exchanged a glance with another officer and nodded toward my bag. "Take a seat, ma'am," he said. A few other passengers glanced in my direction as I hesitated. I wasn't sure what was happening, but I could feel something was off. The officer unzipped my carry-on and started going through it. My laptop, a book, a bag of toiletries, an extra sweater. Everything was neatly packed, nothing suspicious. But they weren't satisfied. "We need to check your pockets." I looked at them, confused. "I don't have anything in my pockets." "Just a precaution," he said, his tone sharper now. I swallowed my frustration and turned out my pockets, empty. But that didn't seem to be enough for them. Another officer walked over, a woman this time, her eyes scanning me like I was some kind of threat. "What's the issue?" I asked, my voice calm but firm. "Just following protocol, ma'am," she replied. Protocol? I had flown dozens of times, and this had never happened before. My heartbeat picked up. A nervous energy ran through my veins. Something told me this wasn't just about security procedures. More people were watching now. A man with a laptop bag frowned as he passed by. A mother with her child pulled her little girl closer. I felt their stares like needles in my skin. Then came the real moment of realization. The officers exchanged another look before the first one finally spoke. "We need you to come with us." My stomach dropped. "For what reason?" I asked, my voice steady despite the growing anxiety creeping up my spine. "Ma'am, please don't make this difficult," he said, avoiding my question. I stood frozen for a moment, my mind racing. I knew I had done nothing wrong. I knew I had followed every rule, every procedure. And yet, here I was, being singled out, treated as if I were some kind of criminal. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "I'd like to know why," I said again, this time louder. A few more heads turned. The officer glanced around before lowering his voice. "We'll explain inside." Inside. That meant out of public view. That meant I would be alone with them, without witnesses. A cold knot of fear twisted in my stomach. Something wasn't right, and I wasn't about to go quietly. I felt my pulse quicken as I stood my ground. The officer's gaze locked onto mine, unblinking, as if daring me to resist. Every instinct in my body screamed that this wasn't right, but I knew better than to argue too much. That never ended well. "Fine," I said, my voice controlled, masking the unease creeping up my spine. I grabbed my bag off the table, but before I could take a step, the officer reached out and placed a firm hand on my arm. "Leave the bag," he said. A chill ran through me. I yanked my arm back, glaring. "Excuse me? Leave the bag. We'll handle it." Handle it? It was just my personal belongings. A laptop, some clothes, my wallet. What exactly did they think I was carrying? At that moment, I noticed something. One of the officers was watching the people around us, scanning the crowd as if making sure no one was paying too much attention. But people were watching. A middle-aged woman in a navy coat frowned in concern. A man with headphones lingered near the checkpoint, eyes flicking between me and the officers. They knew something was off, but no one spoke up. I took a breath and followed them, my body tense with every step. They led me down a narrow hallway, away from the bustling terminal, away from the witnesses. The farther we went, the quieter it became, until I could hear nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. A door swung open ahead, small room, white walls, a single metal chair, a table, no windows. "Have a seat," the officer ordered, stepping aside so I could enter first. I hesitated. Walking into that room felt like stepping into a trap, but refusing wasn't an option. I walked in, sitting down slowly. The air was heavy, suffocating. The officer closed the door behind him, and the click of the lock sent a fresh wave of unease through me. I folded my hands on my lap, my fingers tightening. "Now, can someone tell me what's going on?" The taller officer leaned against the wall, arms crossed. The other one sat across from me, sliding a folder onto the table. He didn't open it. Just let it sit there like some kind of silent threat. "You travel often?" he asked. I blinked. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Just a question." I exhaled through my nose, refusing to play whatever game this was. "I travel when I need to. Now, are you actually going to tell me why I'm here, or are we just going to waste time?" He smirked slightly, as if amused by my pushback. "You were flagged for additional screening. Standard procedure." "Standard?" I scoffed. "I walked through clean. Your scanner didn't beep. My bag is clear. So, what exactly is the problem?" Neither of them answered immediately. That told me everything. The second officer finally spoke. "Do you have any items in your bag that don't belong to you?" My stomach dropped. My mind raced. Was this what they were doing? Trying to frame me for something? "My bag was packed by me," I said slowly, enunciating every word. "I know exactly what's in it." He nodded like he was taking mental notes. "And no one handed you anything before you went through security?" I clenched my jaw. This was ridiculous. "No." The first officer leaned forward slightly. "Then why do we have reason to believe you're carrying something illegal?" A sharp, cold fear lanced through my chest. There it was. The accusation, subtle but dangerous. I sat back, arms crossed. "That's a great question. Why don't you tell me?" A long silence stretched between us. A silent battle. Then the officer smirked again. He stood, grabbing the folder off the table. "All right, let's check your bag." That same gut feeling from earlier returned. Something was very, very wrong. The officer's smirk made my stomach churn. He motioned toward the door, and within seconds another officer entered the room, holding my bag. My bag, my personal belongings, and yet something in the way they carried it, the calculated movements, the unspoken exchange of glances, told me they had already gone through it. I clenched my fists under the table. "I want to see my bag." The officer holding it ignored me. He placed it on the table and unzipped it, his fingers deliberately rummaging through my things as if searching for something. Something they already believed was there, or worse, something they had planted. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. If you've gone through my belongings without my consent, I hope you realize that's illegal. My voice was steady, but I could feel the tightness creeping into my throat. You're being detained for questioning, the officer replied flatly, still searching. For what? What exactly are you accusing me of? Silence. They weren't going to say it outright. That would mean committing to something they could be held accountable for later. Instead, they kept dancing around it, kept making vague implications. I had seen stories like this before. People who looked like me being held for random screenings that conveniently escalated into something far worse. The officer pulled out my laptop, my book, my sweater. He unzipped my toiletry bag, shook out my clothes, then his hand stopped. I sucked in a breath. The officer's fingers wrapped around something. A small plastic bag. My blood ran cold. I had never seen it before. It wasn't mine. What is that? My voice was sharp now, cutting through the thick tension in the air. The smirking officer leaned forward. You tell us. My body went rigid. I stared at the plastic bag in his hand, my mind racing. They wanted me to panic, to start making desperate explanations. But I wasn't about to play into their trap. I had to stay calm. I had to think. You planted that, I said evenly. The officer chuckled. That's a serious accusation, ma'am. You're making a serious accusation too, aren't you? The air between us crackled with unspoken hostility. He placed the plastic bag on the table as if it were some kind of exhibit in a courtroom. I took a deep breath. I want to call my lawyer. The officers exchanged another glance. They had been waiting for me to say that. One of them leaned back, stretching slightly, as if this was just a minor inconvenience for him. You can call after we finish, he said. No, I snapped. I want to call my lawyer now. More silence, more unspoken games. But this time, I saw something flicker in the officer's eyes, hesitation. They had expected me to break down, to get scared, to beg. But I didn't. Instead, I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and dialed. 2 rings, 3. Then a familiar voice. Hello? A breath of relief flooded my chest. I need you here, now. My lawyer didn't need further explanation. She had handled cases like this before. The officers must have realized things were about to change because suddenly their tone shifted. Ma'am, let's not make this harder than it needs to be. Oh, I'm not making anything hard, but when my lawyer gets here, you'll have a lot to explain. For the first time since this nightmare started, I saw it, the flicker of doubt in their eyes. The tension in the room thickened like a storm cloud about to burst. The officers stood rigid, exchanging wary glances as I sat still, gripping my phone tightly. They had played their game, but now the rules were about to change. My lawyer was on her way. One officer sighed, rubbing his temples. You really didn't have to do that, he muttered, as if I was the one making things difficult. I raised an eyebrow. Didn't have to call my lawyer? Why? Because you thought I'd just sit here and accept whatever setup you had planned? His jaw tightened. He didn't like that. The smirking officer leaned forward. You're making a big deal out of nothing. You cooperate, this goes smoothly. I let out a dry laugh. Cooperate with what exactly? The little baggie you magically pulled out of my belongings? The way you tried to isolate me before making your move? Or maybe the part where you refused to let me call my lawyer the first time I asked? His smirk faltered. We sat in silence for a moment, the air between us charged. Then a knock at the door shattered the quiet. The officer closest to the door hesitated before opening it. A woman in a sharp black suit stepped inside, exuding the kind of confidence that made even these men in uniform shift uncomfortably. My lawyer. She barely spared the officers a glance before walking straight to me, her expression calm but firm. "Are you okay?" I nodded, swallowing the tightness in my throat. I wasn't okay, but I would be. She turned to the officers, setting her bag on the table with deliberate precision. "My client has informed me that she's been detained without formal charges, subjected to a search without her consent, and denied legal representation until now. That's a problem." The taller officer straightened, trying to regain control. "Ma'am, this is just a routine security check." "Oh?" My lawyer cut him off smoothly. "Routine? Is that why you pulled her away from the main terminal instead of conducting this so-called search in a public area? Is that why you conveniently found an item in her bag after she had already cleared security?" The room fell silent. The officer cleared his throat. "There was a flag in the system. We were just following protocol." My lawyer's eyes flashed. "Really? Then let's see the footage." Both officers stiffened. "Footage?" The taller one echoed. "Yes, you have security cameras everywhere, don't you?" She folded her arms. "Surely you wouldn't mind showing us the recording of my client's bag being handled from the moment she put it on the conveyor belt to the moment you discovered this mysterious contraband?" Neither of them spoke. My lawyer turned to me. "Did they ever let your bag out of your sight before bringing you here?" I shook my head. "No, but..." My eyes widened slightly. I remembered the way one officer had taken my bag from the table, how they had carried it out of view just long enough before calling me over, long enough to slip something inside. My lawyer saw the realization on my face. She turned back to the officers, her voice sharp. "This looks bad, real bad, and unless you want to explain to a judge why a black woman was detained under suspicious circumstances with no legal grounds, I suggest you make a decision, fast." The smirking officer wasn't smirking anymore. The taller one shifted on his feet. My lawyer pressed on. "Because right now, I'm prepared to call the airport's legal department, the media, and a few civil rights organizations who would love to hear how TSA handles random searches like this." Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Then, finally, the officer by the door exhaled sharply. "You're free to go." I stared. "Just like that?" The taller officer nodded stiffly. "Take your things and go." My lawyer didn't move. An apology. Both men looked at her. She lifted an eyebrow. "You accused my client of something she didn't do. You detained her without cause. You humiliated her. The least you can do is acknowledge that." The officers exchanged a glance. The taller one's jaw clenched. Then, in the stiffest, most reluctant voice possible, he muttered, "We apologize for the inconvenience." I wanted to laugh at how forced it sounded, but I was too tired, too drained. I just grabbed my bag and stood. My lawyer placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder, guiding me toward the door. Just as we stepped out, she glanced back. "Oh, and one more thing." The officers looked up. "We will be filing a formal complaint." With that, we walked away, leaving them in stunned silence. As we walked out of the interrogation room, the air around me felt different. Lighter, yet still heavy with the weight of what had just happened. My hands were still shaking, though I clenched them into fists to steady myself. The bright, sterile lights of the airport terminal felt jarring after the dim, oppressive room I had been trapped in. People bustled around us, completely unaware of the nightmare I had just endured. My lawyer walked beside me, her presence grounding me in the chaos. She was calm, composed, but I could see the fire in her eyes. This wasn't over for her, and honestly, it wasn't over for me either. As soon as we reached a quieter spot near the terminal seating area, She turned to me. "Are you okay?" I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. "I don't know." She nodded, as if she understood exactly what I meant. "You don't have to be." I sat down heavily, my mind still racing through every detail. "If you hadn't come—" My voice trailed off. I didn't want to finish that sentence. "You did the right thing by calling me," she said. "And now, we make sure they don't get away with this." I looked at her, my throat tightening. "Do you really think we can do anything about it? They'll just cover it up. Say it was a misunderstanding, maybe even twist it to make me look like the problem." Her jaw tightened. "They'll try, but we won't let them." She pulled out her phone and opened an email draft. "I'm filing a complaint with the TSA and the airport authorities right now, but I need you to document everything while it's still fresh in your mind, every detail. Who said what, the exact timeline, anything that felt off." I swallowed hard and nodded. I didn't want to relive it, but I knew I had to. As I typed furiously on my phone, piecing together the events, a sinking feeling settled in my stomach. How many others had been through this before? How many had been detained, humiliated, accused without proof, without help? How many had walked out of that same room feeling powerless? But I wasn't powerless. I glanced up at my lawyer, who was already making calls, her voice sharp and unwavering. She was fighting, and so would I. That night, I posted my story online. Not for sympathy, not for validation, but for truth. I described everything, from the moment they pulled me aside to the second I walked out of that room. I wrote about the way they looked at me, the way they spoke to me, the silent assumption that I was guilty before I even opened my mouth. I detailed how my lawyer had dismantled their entire setup in a matter of minutes. Within hours, my post had thousands of shares. People flooded the comments, some with outrage, some sharing their own experiences. Others, predictably, tried to dismiss it, saying I must have done something to deserve it. But the truth was out there now, and it wasn't going away. A few days later, a journalist reached out. Then a civil rights organization. Then an attorney who specialized in discrimination cases. This wasn't just my story anymore, it was a movement. Weeks passed, and the airport issued a public statement, calling it an unfortunate miscommunication. I laughed when I saw it. The same officers who had treated me like a criminal were now scrambling to save face. But a statement wasn't enough. My lawyer pushed forward with legal action, and soon the pressure mounted. An internal investigation was launched. Policies were questioned. One day, months later, I received an email. The officers involved had been placed on leave pending further review. It wasn't the perfect victory, but it was a step toward accountability, a step toward change, and that was all I needed to keep fighting.